For this session, I'm going to be your speaker. In case you missed my name earlier, my name is Martin Morgan. I'm an author and historian. I live locally. I'm a resident of St. Tammany Parish, though. Please don't hold that against me. Thank you to my fellow St. Tammanysians. That's it. There we go. So as you've heard mentioned in previous presentations so far today, this isn't just one battle, but rather a littoral campaign, a campaign that unfolds between Apalachicola and Barataria Bay, Louisiana, a campaign that unfolds within this box that is 300 miles wide, and it's a campaign with action really starting in August of 1814, and continuing through the end of hostilities, which, as we now know, extend well beyond what happened here in Chalmette 201 years ago tomorrow. Now, the reason that I put this presentation together was because I wanted to address a couple of things that come up regularly whenever people discuss the Battle of New Orleans. Because when people discuss the Battle of New Orleans, that overwhelmingly means that they're talking about the January 8th, 1815 action on the plain of Chalmette. It is to the point that it overwhelmingly neglects the actions that came before and after. And then also, I have found that there is a bit of an historical discourse where we imagine that the British were soundly defeated on the plain of Chalmette on January 8, 1815, that the British were forced into an ungoverned or an uncontrolled rout, that the British fled the scene of a field of battle in disorder. And we know that that is not the case. And now, as you've already heard, we also know that what happened here in Chalmette was not even the end of the war. So why is it that we cling to these certain things? Why is it that we cling to this one moment alone, January 8, 1815? Why is it that you encounter people that believe that this was an unquestionable rout? Do you encounter that? I used to teach right here at Elaine P. Nunez Community College. And when dealing with students, it was interesting often to understand that their belief about the Battle of New Orleans was that we whipped the British, drove them off the field of battle in this rather pathetic show of the Grand Army, and that they were shoved out, they were pushed down the length of the Mississippi River. Why do we believe these things? Well, I have an opinion on the matter, and I tend to blame it on the song. As much as I make light of the song, and the song is at times hilarious, and obviously not a genuine historical document, obviously not something that we are to build an historical discourse on. That's all nice talk, but it's meaningless, because this song has reached more people than anything I'm ever going to say or write, than anything that I think most historians are ever going to say or write or sing, unless somebody's going to create a new song about the Battle of New Orleans, one that addresses these historical distortions. I don't imagine that would be a very good song. Nevertheless, Jimmy Driftwood creates the song The Battle of New Orleans, and ironically, Jimmy Driftwood, I'm sure maybe you probably know this. You know what he did? You know what his profession was? He was a history teacher. This, like you all know, of course. I'm telling you things you already know, but Driftwood was a history teacher. He composed the song as a means of helping teach his students about the Battle of New Orleans. And I would argue that at the time that he composed the song, there wasn't a great deal of historiographical sophistication about remembering the War of 1812, let alone the Battle of New Orleans. But he turns the song over to this guy, Johnny Horton, who popularizes it. Horton, who comes up with this, what is my favorite album cover art of all time. This is Johnny Horton's, it's Jimmy Driftwood, not Horton. Horton popularized it. Jimmy Driftwood releases the song because he originally wrote it on his greatest hits album. I looked through the other songs, never heard of any of them. But what I find so fascinating about his album art is not just because I find it visually appealing, but because I find it also some of the best stand-up comedy I've ever sat through in my life. Here you see There he is. Old General Jackson, rampant on horseback. Old Hickory with saber in hand. He looks really healthy there, doesn't he? I think we know the truth about that. Was he really healthy on January 8th, 1815? He was not. And I like the fact that he has those steadfast and steely-eyed Kentucky riflemen there delivering accurate musket fire toward the enemy. And then what else do you see? There's the gator. Do you remember the line in the song? How does it go? I've already forgotten it. And then when we lit it up, the gator lost. This gator appears to be in the process of losing his mind. And so, therefore, an accurate depiction of something. And I've found students of mine quite surprised to learn that we did not actually use alligators as cannon during the Battle of New Orleans. But you heard it here first. We did not do that. There's a historical truism coming from me. I'm the first one with that attitude. But I think more important than a rather idealized image of General Jackson and a silly image of an alligator being used as a cannon, rather than focus on that, I'm more interested in the way that the British are depicted on the album cover. And so when I say things like I blame this distorted discourse about the Battle of New Orleans, when I blame it on the song, I'm not joking entirely. Because this was such an extraordinarily popular musical composition. It reached so many people, and at the center, at the core of this musical composition is a discourse. And it is a discourse wherein what happened here 201 years ago tomorrow is imagined as this outright rout where the enemy is driven in disorder from the field of battle. Among the lyrics, aside, of course, from the gator losing his mind, the one I think the most infatuated with is this one. They ran through the briars and they ran through the brambles. They ran through the bushes where the rabbits wouldn't go. They ran so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them. Down the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico. We all know the song well, don't we? We know this line. And I think everyone in here is kind of on their advanced course of Battle of New Orleans, and you all know that this is really a reflection on fantasy more than an actual historical record or document about what happened during the Battle of New Orleans. But a point I like to make about this particularly is I believe that this line in the song created this discourse about this routed defeat that actually did not happen. But me and my sermon about what actually happened doesn't mean a thing when you look at that. That was the #1 song for the calendar year 1959 on the country and western chart for Billboard. I'm trying to figure out ways, because historians are often required to quantify things, I'm trying to figure out a way to quantify this, to say this is how many people were reached by the song, The Battle of New Orleans in 1959. It's providing some challenges in terms of coming up with a number, being able to say this many people listened to this song. And so without really having a great deal of accuracy in quantifying this, I'm just going to say a whole hell of a lot of people heard this song, which is not very historical, but I hope that you'll forgive me just for the sake of this presentation. Nevertheless, a very, very large number of people were reached by this song. These people were, I believe, affected by this discourse, so that when you fast forward from 1959 to 1975, when I'm 6 years old and I learned about the Battle of New Orleans for the first time, it's understandable that I had a teacher that taught me basically the discourse presented in the Jimmy Driftwood, Johnny Horton song. But what really happened? And this is where it gets interesting. Now, we all know the story of how this battle played out. We've heard presenters that are far more capable and articulate than I am that have told you this already today, and you're going to hear more on Sunday. Oh, by the way, I do hope you'll return on Sunday because we have a great lineup of speakers that day as well. But the reality is that the Battle of New Orleans marks one moment in a broad littoral campaign. It marks a moment where the British suffered a serious setback. It's a little bit of an understatement to say that they suffered a setback when they had almost all of their officer leadership killed on the field of battle, where they failed to accomplish the overall objective, which was seizing the city of New Orleans. But the reality is that in the aftermath of that defeat, they didn't turn and run. They didn't run so fast that the hounds couldn't catch them, unless those were really slow old hounds. Because the British didn't leave immediately. In fact, they kind of didn't leave for quite a long time. And that's what I wanted to spell out for you now in discussing what was a really challenging infiltration operation, followed by a very even more challenging exfiltration. A word quickly then about the infiltration. You've already heard how the British fleet anchors in the area of the Chandeleur Islands around Cat Island. They then have to row in open boats from the area where Mississippi Sound meets the open Gulf of Mexico. And they had to row into Lake Borgne, a distance from Cat Island to the mouth, to the entrance of Lake Borgne is a distance of about 55 miles. It's kind of a long way to go in an open boat journey. They had to fight a naval engagement before they got there. You've heard then about how they were directed toward and assisted by fishermen at the mouth of Bayou Catalan, which we now call Bayou Bienvenue, how they then followed the bayou until it split off to Bayou Mazant, and they followed that all the way down to the Villeray Canal, which brought them to the plain of Chalmette, which effectively set the stage for this battle. I shouldn't say this battle, but the series of battles that would then follow. And you've already heard about those engagements, the engagement of the 23rd, the engagement of the 28th, the engagement of January 1st, leading then ultimately and climactically to the engagement of January 8th. January 8th depicted here in a painting, a well-known painting that is also, I believe, a little bit idealized, but nevertheless depicting a triumphant United States led by General Jackson in combat. Again, a General Jackson who's looking much, much stronger and healthier than he actually was at the time. And you have in this piece of art, this example, providing something that underscores, that supports and promotes the idea of it having been a routed victory. Well, the reality is that following the battle, that's not exactly how it played out. I'm going to back up real quick. Well, I'll just take it from here. So in the aftermath of the battle on January 8th, the British do not immediately evacuate the battlefield and flee back to the ships to depart. In fact, it's, just to jump ahead, it's effectively 2 weeks before they're really gone. The main distraction that occurs in the immediate aftermath of the action on the plain of Chalmette on January 8th is that some of Cochrane's forces are then sent down to the mouth of the river. They enter the Mississippi River and they sail up to a point just below, as you're all familiar with, Fort St. Philip. And they commence this bombardment. The bombardment of Fort St. Philip unfolds over the course of the next 9 days. And during that 9-day period of time, these British warships, from a distance of just over 2 miles, 2.25 miles, bombard an American garrison of almost 600 men inside Fort St. Philip, originally built by the Spanish, improved upon by the United States government. During the course of this 9-day bombardment, 1,000 rounds are fired by the British. That's over 110 rounds every day, depending on the volume of fire. In other words, what amounts to a rather serious bombardment. And these bombardments have happened before. There's been a significantly important bombardment at Baltimore Harbor against Fort McHenry, and here is another one unfolding on the Mississippi River below the city of New Orleans, pointed toward Fort St. Philip. During the course of this bombardment, though, interesting things are happening back up on the plain of Chalmette. Because on the plain of Chalmette, there's initially almost no reaction. In fact, U.S. troops at the still occupying Line Jackson don't observe the movement, a serious movement of British forces until January 15th, a week after the battle. So 1 week after the battle, they begin to detect signs indicating a British withdrawal. Then, as of the 18th, a prisoner of war exchange cartel is established, during which British prisoners are exchanged for Americans who were captured mostly during the night battle. And then the British pull off something that I feel we trivialize a little bit, because we don't languish it with attention. We don't lavish it with attention. We don't look at this British withdrawal and recognize it for being militarily genius. And I believe that's what it was, and I'm going to argue for that now. Because what had to happen at this point is that, as you know, you've already heard how Lambert is now commanding. Lambert has this one initial tactical slip-up in that he voluntarily abandons the West Bank, which could have been the arrow in the quiver that could have won the battle for him. But he voluntarily withdraws. He then has to make a series of tactical decisions. What do we do? Where do we go? The process of withdrawing this force is incredible because he has a force of, at this stage, if Ron's still in the room, it's, I think, 7,500 men. He's got a very large fighting force. The total number of men killed on the plain of Chalmette on January 8th is in the neighborhood of 600 or 700. There are more casualties, of course, but the number of killed is around that number. It's enough to stop the battle, but it's not enough to make this, to reduce this fighting force into something that's meaningless or no longer dangerous. The reality is that in the aftermath of January 8th, this extremely dangerous, extremely well-armed, and powerful fighting force remained fully ensconced in St. Bernard Parish. And it didn't show signs of going anywhere for a full week. On January 15th, there's the recognition that the enemy may be doing something. On January 18th, they negotiate this exchange cartel. On the 19th, the exchange is completed, and a note is given to General Jackson indicating that General Lambert has, I can't remember the exact wording, but he has given up all designs on the city of New Orleans, indicating that he is withdrawing. But he's still not completely gone. The 19th and 20th are critical days because this is the point at which there is a brief and half-hearted pursuit of the enemy. I'd like to go into the details of that. So there you're seeing the plain of Chalmette. Line Jackson's just there. The British have begun this process of exfiltration. They used the same route that they had used for infiltration, that route that brought them through Bayou Catalan and brought them all the way down to the Villeray Canal. And then they simply moved forces back and then along this rat line, along the canal, that takes them to and through a series of redoubts. Redoubts that were built when they were establishing the force on land, and then redoubts that were strengthened in the aftermath of the January 8th battle to cover that force's withdrawal. You see how the force pulls back initially along the Villeray Canal to a strong redoubt, as it was described, built at the confluence of that canal and Bayou Mezent. That force then followed this pathway, and the British made extensive use of corduroy road, which I'm sure you're familiar with. It's effectively logs laid in the marsh so that you have a solid roadway. Their force is moving along the corduroy road that brings them then ultimately down here to where another redoubt called Fort Villeray and another breastwork on the other side of the bayou are covering a pontoon bridge that allows them to cross the bayou and then continue on another corduroy road, one that is even more significant and important as it crosses the big bend in Bayou Bienvenue, until finally they reached the 1,000-man redoubt as it was described. And this was a covering fortification that the British established to provide protection for their forces while they were engaged in the oh-so-delicate and oh-so-difficult process of taking men off of land, putting them on the boats that will then row them back out to the fleet. Of course, from there, on the boats, out they go again for the 55-mile trip all the way back to Cat Island. By the 20th of January, Lambert has effectively removed the entire force with most of its equipment from the plain of Chalmette, through the swamps and bayous, out across Lake Borgne, and has gotten them back to Cat Island. They follow roughly this path. On Cat Island, they have established a base camp, a camp of operations that is supporting the process of transshipping, of bringing in these small boats that men have just exhaustively rowed all the way across Lake Borgne. They transship onto the island. They have a camp established there, and that camp is supporting the process of loading men, taking those men off of the small boats and transitioning them onto the larger boats that will then carry them down to where the ocean-going fleet is anchored closer to the Chandeleur Islands. It takes almost a full week for this to happen. In fact, the process of transitioning the men from the small boats onto Cat Island and then onto the big ships and to the point that they're ready to depart, that is completed on January 27th. And a point I'd like to make here is that going back a few days, going back to the time period of the 20th, 21st, and 22nd, this is the time period when you see the full maturity of the British evacuation from the plain of Chalmette. You see that they are now fully gone from the area. The 18th was the conclusion of the bombardment against Fort St. Philip. Jackson knows that the enemy is still out there. He knows that the enemy can still strike again and that the enemy remains dangerous. He keeps everyone on Line Jackson until the 22nd. And it's on the 22nd that men are finally allowed to leave Line Jackson and return to the city. But not all of the men. Because the men of the U.S. Army's 7th Infantry Regiment, the regulars that are mounted, that are occupying a part of Line Jackson, they are required to remain behind. And that is because Jackson is still not completely convinced that the enemy has left. It's not until some full reports indicate that the area is thoroughly empty of enemy forces that Jackson begins to relax this posture that he had been on going back all the way into December. As you may well know, there is this brilliant moment on January 23rd, 1815, where a service of thanksgiving is held at St. Louis Cathedral, where there is a great celebration about this spectacular victory. Of course, the service of Thanksgiving is January 23rd, and I've often thought that if I do later in my life master the ability at time travel, as I predict I will, I would like to go back and tell, hey, Jimmy Driftwood, they didn't have the service of Thanksgiving until January 23rd. The enemy didn't leave the Cat Island area until the 27th, so for 2 full weeks, the enemy's still there. That would have to be a hound that is aged and decrepit, that can't run fast enough. Anyway, the point is, the enemy stayed behind. The enemy stayed behind a lot longer than the song gives it credit, and the enemy remained dangerous. And even from this point, even from the point of January 27th, the enemy is still significantly threatening. And the enemy is not done. The enemy looks at January 8th as a setback. And they're going back to plan A. Because this route of moving into Lake Bourne and intruding in through the bayous and marshes of St. Bernard Parish to deliver them to the plain of Chalmette, that was plan B. Plan A, as it was all along, was Mobile Bay. The British had attempted that, as you've already heard, in September of 1814 with disastrous results. Now they're about to attempt it again, because the British operations against the city of New Orleans are not over with. After a week worth of delay from rain, the British force then sails down the length of Mississippi Sound, a distance of, I think, about 65, 66 miles, to Dauphin Island, Alabama. Has anybody ever been there? Great little place, isn't it? So you know where Fort Gaines is today? Sort of north of where the footprint of the Fort Gaines installation is. The British then eventually establish a camp there. The British begin landing their forces on Dauphin Island on February 7th, 1815. Just across the mouth of Mobile Bay, Americans are watching, and Americans are concerned about what's about to happen next. Americans, not here at Fort Morgan, but where the Red X is located. Has anybody been to Fort Morgan? Did you enjoy it? Great place to visit. It's my first job out of grad school working there as a park ranger, and I loved it with my friend Chris Gimble, who is in the audience today somewhere. Where's Chris? There's Chris in the back. Thanks for coming, Chris. Well, Chris and I when we worked there, it was very interesting to us to attempt to interpret the military history of that site, because you have the big brick fortification that dates from the 1830s, and we would often find that it was also, kind of assigned to being merely a footnote, the fact that where you see the red X once stood an earthwork fort called Fort Boyer. You've already heard about it. Well, when the British depart the area around New Orleans, when they finally get everybody on the ships and they suffer through a week's worth of drizzle and miserable rain, and they finally depart Cat Island anchorage February 3rd, they then proceed to Dauphin Island, and their design is to attack Fort Boyer, which is seen in this watercolor. When Fort Boyer was first imagined, it was imagined that it would be this curved battery oriented toward the natural channel leading into Mobile Bay. Originally imagined in this way as a sort of sophisticated and beautifully built fort, and ultimately it was built to a much more modest design. As of the second week of February of 1815, you have a force of 375 U.S. Army soldiers from the 2nd Infantry Regiment occupying the fort. They're commanded by Major William T. Lawrence. And Major Lawrence watches beginning on February 6th, because it's on the 6th that Lawrence and his men jot down their first sightings of the British across the bay at Dauphin Island. Just 3 miles away, they can see them. Then eventually on, I guess it would be February 9th. No, it's the 8th. February 8th, a force of 5,000 infantry are transferred across Mobile Bay, north of Mobile Point, where Fort Boyer was situated, where Fort Morgan would ultimately be built. Transitions this force and lands them at a place that's 3 miles east of Fort Morgan, 3 or 4 miles, called Navy Cove. And if you've ever been there, there's a little place where you can buy beer and ice at Navy Cove now. There's not much there to indicate this, but this became an incredibly important place, because I would like to say the number again. They land 5,000 men at Navy Cove, and Major Lawrence inside Fort Boyer has 375 men. So the enemy has arrived with overwhelming numerical superiority. The enemy is in good order, and the enemy is extremely well armed. This is not a fighting force that was routed on the plain of Chalmette. This is a fighting force that has come back for more, and they're about to fight the last major land battle of the war. Now, as the British begin staging on Dauphin Island with the fleet anchored in that area generally, they transfer forces across, with one big force being carried across on February 8th. Another big force is brought across on the 10th. And after being brought across, they begin digging siege works. Now, in this image, it's flipped so that the top of the screen is south, the bottom of the screen is north toward Mobile. There you can see Fort Boyer, and here you're seeing drawings indicating the way that the enemy advanced its entrenchments toward Fort Boyer. It was to the extent that as of the morning of February 11th, 1815, when Major Lawrence and his men woke up, they found that the enemy had overnight advanced a trench to within 40 meters of the wall of the fort. The enemy had also by that time positioned 24 pieces of artillery, some 8-pounders, some howitzers, and some mortars. They had an undescribed number of other additional guns of lesser caliber, whatever that means. I'm still not entirely sure. But the enemy has brought a significant amount of firepower to the battle in the form of artillery. Major Lawrence, with his men inside the fort, realized they've moved in so close, they're in a position to strangle us. The guns of Fort Boyer are oriented to the west, in other words, to protect the channel. They're not oriented toward the landward approaches to Fort Boyer, and that's exactly the direction from which the enemy approached the fortification. And I mention all of this to illustrate one major concluding point, and that is that in a very swift order of time, stretching from February 8th until February 11th, the enemy has landed a significant opposing infantry force supported by artillery within a few miles of this fort. They have then moved into a stranglehold position extremely close to the fort, and as of the morning of February 11th, 40 meters from the walls of the fort. That's very close. And it was under these circumstances that Major Lawrence recognized one undeniable fact, and that is that there's nothing that else can happen here aside from dying. And so in the afternoon on February 11th, he raised a white flag. There were negotiations, and the negotiations concluded that a surrender ceremony would take place the next day, February 12, 1814. And then ultimately, that following day, the surrender was concluded. And I think sometimes it's overlooked. When we focus all of our attention, when we're infatuated with what happened here on January 8th, we overlook this important detail. That's not to say that January 8th isn't important. It is. It's historically important in the overall picture of the conflict. It's culturally important to the identity of the United States of America. Because had things gone differently here, you've already heard from smarter people how the course of American history could have gone in a completely different direction. And who knows what language we would now be speaking? Probably Spanish. Yeah. At any rate, that fighting force that was dealt a significant setback before Line Jackson comes to Mobile Point and delivers one final victory for king and country. They weren't going to stop there, though, because the aftermath of reducing and causing the capitulation of Fort Boyer was then going to open the way for movement toward the city of Mobile, which would have then involved the landing of an infantry force that would have then followed trails inland all the way across what are now the 3 counties of coastal Mississippi, all the way back into Louisiana, across St. Tammany Parish, and probably to Baton Rouge to outflank the city from its westward approaches. So they win this victory, and they're still coming to get the city of New Orleans. But then, fortuitously, on Valentine's Day, February 14, 1815, the HMS Brazen sails up. Brazen had sailed up from Jamaica, and Brazen carries word of the Treaty of Ghent. And as we now know, as you've heard described earlier, that this is a treaty that negotiations had been concluded on Christmas Eve, but that doesn't mean anything. Is it safe for me to say that, all you other history people? The fact that the treaty negotiations had been concluded were, I think, almost meaningless because of the fact that it still required king's signature and the ratification of the United States Senate, all 35 members of them. Isn't that cute? We had a time period when we had 35 members of the Senate. At any rate, it wasn't this. That gets applause. Naturally, I don't blame you on that. Then ultimately, the British chargé d'affaires comes to Washington, D.C. Wasn't it Anthony St. John Baker? I believe it was Baker. He carries the treaty with the king's signature on it to Washington. And then finally, it's signed by the 35 members of the United States Senate on February 16th, signed by President Madison on February 17th, and it concludes the hostilities. The rest, as we say, is history. But, as you heard from the previous speaker, do you consider the attack on Fort Boyer, the British victory at Fort Boyer, do you consider that the last battle of the War of 1812? Or do you consider, what was it, the Peacock and the Nautilus all the way in June? Is that the last battle of the War of 1812? And with this provision of the full force and effect of the treaty lagging through 180 days, that puts you to a final date of August 10th. From the date of American ratification. Whatever the case, I don't know if it's necessary for everyone to walk around with this full breadth of knowledge about all of the actions that occurred after January 8th. But I do think it's important for us to recognize that the enemy was still coming back to this city, and had the clock not run out, they probably would have done a lot better the second time around than they did the first time around. Wouldn't you agree? Big, dangerous opposing force out there with a pretty good plan. Because to tell you the truth, Plan A, which was the Mobile route, the Mobile through coastal Mississippi route, I know it wasn't Mississippi then, I'm just using that because as a term of convenience. But that coastal route, I think that's the better plan than the one that they ultimately tried to pull off the whole operation with. But nevertheless, while it's important for us to cling to this incredibly significant moment in our national history. And it's important for us to respect it and to be proud of it. It's also important for us to understand that we dealt with a real enemy. We dealt with a very, very skilled enemy who was powerful and dangerous well beyond January 8th, 1815.